All right, so you know that I'm not a neoconservative war hawk, but honestly, shame on Donald Trump for getting out of Syria and leaving the Kurds behind. I think that that whole thing is a tragedy in and of itself, but leaving behind people who have been a stateless people persecuted by North, South, East, and West, as well as our allies in fighting ISIS, unlike the so-called moderate rebels of the FSA who are allied with ISIS. There is just something that I find to be morally reprehensible about that. It harkens back to what happened in Vietnam, where the South Vietnamese that were fighting for the Americans were left to fend for themselves.
So, what's the story? What happened? Who are the Kurds?
The Kurds are an ethnically Iranian people who have existed for thousands of years within the region of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and this whole area has been split after the colonial conquest and the nationalistic movements that started up right after, where, for example, in Turkey, you had a percentage of people living there who were Kurds, who ended up just like the Armenians getting genocided during that period of the Young Turks. And I wonder, like, if back then...
Back up. It's not the Young Turks. That's a brand.
No, it's not a brand. What the fuck are you talking about? The Young
Young
Turks
Turks
was a nationalist movement during the early 20th century in Turkey that modernized Turkey, but at the same time was responsible for mass Armenian genocide, as well as the genocide of Kurdish people.
Okay.
So anyway, we have people like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who instituted many positive reforms as far as not being that religious-based of a society. But at the same time, he was one of the people who prevented there from being an official Kurdistan, where after World War I, there were plans in the Treaty of Sèvres to create this autonomous area that the Kurds could call home. But the Turkish government wanted none of that. So right now you just have these stateless people who are living in these different regions who are being persecuted. Like going back to Turkey, since the 1980 military coup, Kurdish language was not allowed to be sung in the streets, to be spoken in public, to be learned in school. And similar things were happening in Syria as well. So these are people like if we talk about, for example, the poor Palestinians that people say are being persecuted by the Israelis, for some reason nobody gives a shit about the Kurds who are being persecuted on a daily basis throughout the whole early 20th century till now.
You said coup earlier, but you meant coup?
I meant coup.
So what's the other side of the story? Why do we have a popular media company called the Young Turks? And why would some people, let's say, argue for the opposing side regarding the Kurds story?
Well, the biggest thing that I'd say people would be against as far as helping out the Kurds, I don't think it would be from any sentimentality to the people who hate the Kurds. I think it would mainly come from a pacifistic point of view of not wanting America to get involved in any kind of conflict.
Why would anyone hate the Kurds? Like, why does Turkey hate the Kurds?
Well, why do Shiites hate Sunnis? You know, like there's all this resentment that was built up from decades or centuries of hostility. There's no logical way to explain why one group really hates the other. I don't think anybody should hate anybody, yet this is what we have today. Like, as far as the Kurds wanting their own place to call home, I could see why there would be people in Turkey that would be against that if they don't want to secede any of their territory. Same thing with Syria. Same thing with Iraq. Although in Iraq there is an autonomous region called Kurdistan that a lot of the Kurdish refugees have been fleeing to ever since a lot of this Arab Spring and Syria civil war conflict has started. But now on the other side, you have Turkey now going into these regions in Syria. And what are the possible things that could happen from here? Well, we have prisoners who are ISIS members who are now under Turkish control. And I'd be curious to see what exactly Turkey's going to be doing with those people, as well as what Turkey's going to be doing with the Kurds that they hate so much.
What's your opinion of Turkey?
Well, like I said before regarding Kemal Ataturk, who was this great Turkish leader and reformer, I'd say great, not in the sense of being morally great, you know, or not being evil, but just in the sense that this was somebody who created a lot of great secular reforms in a country that was under the thumb of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. And with that, you have a lot of good things, but you also have a lot of this nationalistic control over populations who really want to have self-governance. And with that came the Armenian genocide and the Kurdish genocide as well. So as far as balancing those two things out, I could see great positives happening in Turkey as well as great negatives. And I think with Erdogan as a president, it's not looking that good. And we've spoken with people who are living in Turkey and go back to Turkey during the elections and talk about how they want to overthrow this guy.
Any reason why Trump would want to be putting more and more pressure on Turkey?
Well, right now, Turkey is going to be crossing, you could say, Trump's red line. Like people talk about Obama having a red line as far as what is not allowed to be done in the world of geopolitics. Well, Trump is talking about enacting all these sanctions on Turkey. But when Turkey is going into Syria right now and taking over these territories, and there will be hell to pay for a lot of the Kurds that are there, Trump was not mentioning the Kurds when he was talking about Turkey. He was not mentioning the people that he was abandoning. And that's not a great sign to me. So it also isn't a great sign when Trump was talking about how Turkey is a NATO member, and Turkey is an official member of NATO. But honestly, the kind of things that they have gotten away with in the past, it really makes me want to revoke that membership from them.
I think if there's a reason why Trump wants to put pressure on Turkey, like the way I pay attention to things is like, I think there's a lot of wisdom in Nassim Taleb's advice that like you should do your best to not read the news at all, or to like step away from the news. And because it's like one way to cure yourself of reading a newspaper is something like always read the day before's news, right? And just see how off everybody is in their chatter. I think just like I don't listen to what Trump says, I try to watch what he does. Like I just feel like an impartial observer watching what Trump is doing with Turkey. And I feel like Trump knows how to wag the dog a little bit. So, I mean, it's not really an answer, but it is an explanation for not having an opinion.
I could see that. What you're talking about, reading the news a day late, I'd go further and say that I think it's helpful to read news that are decades and decades late regarding similar things. So if we're talking, for example, about after World War I, we totally screwed Germany over, and that led to the rise of Adolf Hitler. If we would have been around and not been such assholes about the situation and not caused Germany to go into an economic spiral, then we may have prevented a World War II from occurring. But there are certain situations, though, like when we had the civil war in Syria, that wasn't something that we started officially, although you could say that with the Iraq war, that definitely helped fan the flames of revolution in Syria. But still, once we were there, we were doing pretty bad stuff. Like we were arming these moderate rebels who ended up working together with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So we definitely did a lot of damage there. But I have to balance that out with the idea that if we leave these stateless people to get slaughtered, morally, regardless of any realpolitik bullshit, morally that just feels wrong. If you don't know what realpolitik is, I just want to make sure that people understand what I'm saying. It is a system of politics based on practical rather than moral or ideological considerations. And that is something that we had with Henry Kissinger. And as you remember, Trump was being very chummy with old Henry Kissinger. And you remember how much of an anti-Christ-like figure this guy was back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. He was the behind-the-scenes man for a lot of these presidential administrations, including Nixon's, who was in charge of, instigating all these deals. And his worldview is not a worldview that includes morals in it, where he thinks that the ends justify the means. But I think that there is a balance that could be achieved here, where I don't want us to be stuck in a quagmire with Syria. But at the same time, what if there was some more surreptitious way that we would be able to make sure that people would be defended from ethnic cleansing, while at the same time not having some permanent footprint there.
So we're 20 trillion in debt. There's rising tensions with China. Trump has said, whether he's genuine or not, that he thinks if he loses the election, the country's going to hell. What that could be is in an economic collapse. It could be a Great Depression. It could be mass starvation. It could be incredible, unfathomable global instability. So if Yuval Noah Harari is saying he sees two possibilities for the future, one is a bunch of cooperating / competing fortresses, and the other is a global world order. So if it was the global world order option, it's either going to be a one world government under a coalition that emerges from like a NATO, EU, UN, WTO co-op, or it's going to be a top-down imperialist world police. And if it's the localist option of competing and cooperating strongholds, it would conjure the analogy of Trump's 2016 election of the Flight 93 election, as in he's hijacked the plane and now he's trying to land it before it crashes and burns. So doing big moves like, as you say, betraying the Kurds and putting that pressure and focus on Turkey could be he's trying to not be an imperialist world power, bizarro Henry Kissinger, but he's trying to get into the stronghold so that when he's gone, he can feel like he looked out for America first.
That's well said. What I want to take a look at is a possible patchwork of countries that are working together, like you said, like these fortresses, but at the same time, they would be of a certain level where they would be able to put certain collective pressure on the countries that are not obeying, certain norms, that are either invading other countries like Russia was doing with Ukraine and Georgia, or like Turkey is doing right now with the Kurdish minority in Syria. Because right now the answer just seems to be, let's get out of there. Whatever promises we made to these people, they don't apply anymore. Look at our economy. We can't worry about this anymore. We're on our own. While what I think may happen in, let's say, the future scenario is, I guess you could call it a big boys club or whatever, but just a certain group of countries that are able to have higher expectations of humanity and would be able to call countries out on BS like that and work together. I don't see, honestly, the UN as being that kind of entity, because I think that they're full of these countries that aren't living up to those same expectations. So whoever it is that's going to be in this alliance, even if America is the one that's the most in charge, I mean, let's face it, as far as Europe goes, as far as countries that have more or less a democratic Republican system, America has never invaded those countries since World War II. So since World War II, the countries that have played ball as far as, being economically stable and having a way for people not to live like this underclass that constantly gets abused like we have in Turkey.
I mean, I think that is a big question to keep open, is how isolationist can you be? And, I do think America probably does too much, but I think it's kind of like, I think solving some of those feedback loops might require making things worse before they can get things better. Like if you were to cynically think about how the EU is created and how difficult it is for Brexit to actualize. It's because the designers have made it so severe to back out that to do it is, like, in the short term, very, very, very painful and unpleasant. And so if you're entangled globally in all sorts of complex ways, and the only way to remedy them is to you have to either like back out, or you have to keep pouring money into it. And if you look at the things that government pours money into, and it's lives as well, it's really not just money, it's lives. You pour more and more money into public education, and nothing improves. You pour more and more money into, our healthcare system. We spend more money on healthcare, I think, than any country in the world. And we also have we have very subpar healthcare. So just because you're pouring money into things doesn't mean you're getting value for it. So, when I look at the Young Turks here, like the so-called progressive left, I'm pretty confident they advocate for a one world government. And I'm very confident you have a lot of establishment people, leftist people, maybe even people that would consider themselves liberals, who also want a one world government. And the reason is because they want to level America's imperialist role, because they think America has been unaccountable to anyone or anything other than itself. And they've pointed out that they'd rather it not be that way.
It's funny that they don't consider their own role in creating this world government to have far more potentially disastrous effects than what they have seen from the Americans. For some reason, I guess they think that, if we did it, it would be better. It would be.
But
peaceful.
That's sort of what it sounds like you're saying too. So it does seem hard to criticize what they want compared to what you want. Like, as an outsider, if I were to say there's that side and that side and not consider like third or fourth options and more, it seems like both sides are making the same argument in slightly different ways.
The problem that I see is that if we have a scenario where we exit a lot of these countries, let's say get rid of all our military bases, think of how much money is going into those things, right? As well as, in general, a lot of government contracts are way more expensive than they need to be, which is another conversation. But if we were to get rid of those bases, what I don't want to have happen is something that, unfortunately, today, because the world isn't just made up of, like the US, Europe, Japan, and a couple of other countries, but it's also made up of countries that are expansionist by nature, like Russia. And we've seen that before, where Russia goes into a country, knows that it's surrounded by pussies, and knows that they're not going to do anything about it. So they go into a country and take it over. They've done this in Georgia, and they've done this in Ukraine. My question to you is, if we don't have those super expensive military bases that are currently occupying all these different countries in Europe and so on, what would countries that are expansionist by nature do as a response to there being this gap of power?
Well, ultimately, I'm not sure if there's anything wrong with other countries getting power or not. I think if from an isolationist perspective...
Tell that to my Latvian friends who are scared to fucking death of getting invaded by Russia. People out there are actually worried about stuff that they used to be worried about thousands of years ago with barbarians at the gates. That shit still exists.
So then then you need more people to be heard advocating for what you want.
And they love America. They love the fact that America has all these stupid fucking bases everywhere, Like, we aren't living their lives. We don't know what it's like to have people right next door to you that want nothing more than to invade your country, turn it into a shithole just so the people back home who are also starting to have less and less food on the table don't revolt against their dictator, which is what's happening in Russia today. I want the countries that are not in a good way right now, where people are being persecuted, to eventually get to the same level that, not even looking at America or Europe, but that, countries in Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia, countries that have experienced a lot of these growing pains and have become what they are today. I want that same transformation to occur in a lot of these Middle Eastern countries, where the blood feuds that go on there, as well as the religious feuds, is at a level you
Well,
and
so do
me
your
can never
opponents.
comprehend.
So do a lot of your opponents. The ones advocating for, the ones that demonize America and want a one world government.
But those same opponents don't just want there to be certain ways that those countries are ruled. They want all of Europe and America and the States to be ruled in the same way. They want them to be ruled according to the ideals that they find to be right. Well, what I'm advocating for is, when it comes to the choice of the individual in these countries, much like we have different states with different laws, which I am for states' rights. I am for that kind of model being applied to a lot of these other countries. But I also know that in a lot of these Middle Eastern countries, your voting bloc is going to have another priority in mind, which is going to be, how do we fuck over the people who we have a blood feud with? And how do we get cozy with the people who happen to be in charge? That's the model that's been part of the strongman model too. When the Ba'ath Party started taking off in the Middle East, like in Iraq and in Syria, like the Assads, they come from the Baathists. And the Ba'ath Party was a nationalistic party who, was always preaching about, now the power is going to be with the people. But ultimately what it was is a strongman party that had certain familial ties or religious ties. So Assad comes from this Muslim sect called the Alawites. So the Alawite minority living in Syria had a lot of favor, and still has a lot of favor during his regime, when all the others do not. That is sectarian bullshit. So what I'm saying is that one way to avoid sectarian bullshit like that is to have somewhat of a higher responsibility figure that would make sure shit like that doesn't go down in those countries. Morally speaking, is that bad?
I'm not saying there's anything bad. I'm just trying to resolve the conflict of visions that I see occurring between people who see themselves on opposite sides of a political spectrum. But what it really sounds like you're advocating for is just an American referee, and you're not saying that you don't think referees should have skin in the game and suffer consequences for making bad calls. But I am somewhere between what you're talking about and the agnosticism that I'm thinking about right now.
So one last thing that I would add, though, is, while I agree with you about the referee aspect here, when we have certain deals that we made with countries, especially, and I'd say more or less exclusively, with people who are a minority that's being persecuted and that's going to be eaten alive in a country if we exit it, those, I'd say, are the very few but important situations where we can't just flip the table over and leave.
All right. Yeah, I think it's important that we're talking about this. So.
Well, so that's it. I hope everything gets resolved in a good way here. But like I said before, really not happy with this decision. This is definitely a shame on you Trump moment for me.
Well, I hope that there's a reason for it, so I don't rush to judgment because I don't pretend to know what's going on.
Oh, we'll see what happens. I hope for the best. All right, Jules, thank you so much.
Thank you.